Hello, I'm Matt Lampert,
Greetings, I'm Robert Folsom.
and welcome to Pop Trends Price Culture, the videocast about social mood and markets. Now, Robert, you came up with today's topic, so I will leave the big reveal on what it is to you, but I just wanted to say at the outset to our viewers, if you're looking for something to add to your New Year's resolution list, consider adding being a clearer thinker. And whether you want to think more clearly in your investing life, your personal life, professional life, well, our hope is that you just might find some insights in today's episode that will help to get you there.
Yeah, indeed, Matt. So cognitive bias is our topic, what it is, and especially, we'll emphasize a couple of types of cognitive bias that often manifest among investors. And for context, we'll also discuss, of course, the role of social mood, and we'll mention a couple of humble suggestions we have for how to manage cognitive bias. And I may be getting ahead of myself by asking this before we even define cognitive bias, but here goes. Matt, why is cognitive bias even relevant to talk about? Why does it matter?
Yeah, well, it matters a good deal. Cognitive biases are basically errors in perception. They show up as beliefs and emotions that quite literally alter how we comprehend reality. So to the extent that you want to have a better grip on reality, it helps to have a better understanding of your sources of cognitive bias. Now, as for why that matters in a practical sense, say to an investor, well, here's one thought. If you ask the typical investor to name their biggest obstacle to success in the markets, often you'll hear a reply like, well, it was someone else's bad advice, or I missed an opportunity, or hey, I got out too soon, something like that, or maybe even, well, you just can't trust Wall Street. But in fact, an investor's worst enemy has never been Wall Street. Of course, it may not be wise to assume that Wall Street is your friend, but the true arch villain of the individual investor does not lurk in a corporate boardroom. And it's not even missed opportunity or an unforeseen event that gets in your way. If you're an investor and you really want to look at your worst enemy right in the eye, all you have to do is find a mirror, because the cognitive biases that lead to errors in perception can in turn lead to errors in judgment and poor decisions in financial markets and beyond.
Yeah, that's well put. You mentioned asking the average investor to cite their biggest obstacle to market success. And, I'm sure that at least a few would know themselves well enough to say, my emotions are my greatest obstacle. And perhaps even a few who, let's say, majored in psychology or economics might mention cognitive bias. But either way, an acknowledgement like that is sure to come from someone who's had a lot of failures before they became successful. And yes, missed opportunities, unforeseen events, they can be costly, but they're not your worst enemy. Your emotions are, as you just said, Matt, and that's the brutal truth. So, let's discuss a couple of specific types of cognitive bias that are especially relevant to investors. Can you please take the one that's most prevalent in periods of positive social mood?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we know that when social mood is positive, a rising trend in the stock market follows. And that positive mood trend engenders growing confidence, growing bullishness among investors. And in time, more and more people become market participants. They jump into the market. Individually and collectively, you'll start to hear people say things like, well, the rising market is what justifies being bullish.
Yeah.
And they start to believe that this pattern of favorable outcomes is normal. They'll say, hey, I'm buying the market because it's rising, and I'm buying pullbacks because, hey, you're supposed to buy the pullbacks, right? But the only information content in those arguments is that they're saying, I'm bullish. And as social mood grows even more positive, that confidence becomes overconfidence. And the overconfidence effect is a well-recognized cognitive bias. The Greeks called it hubris. When you are overconfident, you lose perspective. You overweigh your investing skills as the reason for your investing success. And we've seen how all of this becomes acute late and long-term positive social mood trends. Investors become less aware of risks. They don't perceive them. Phrases like "you only live once," YOLO, become a rallying cry. And other cognitive biases tend to flow from this trend in social mood and overconfidence, like the bandwagon effect. The tendency to follow the choices of others. You get these massive run-ups in particular financial assets. We saw that fairly recently in the cryptos and the meme stocks. And we also saw what happens after that massive run-up when the mood shifts. The thing is, Robert, these biases are known and studied by folks in behavioral finance and psychology. But what they often miss is the underlying social mood component, which regulates when and how society is more likely to act on these feelings. And just to name one more, there's also hindsight bias, and that's where investors tend to remember decisions that led to positive outcomes while forgetting or disclaiming responsibility for decisions with less favorable results. And of course, doing that prevents learning and the potential for improved outcomes in the future. So instead, when mood becomes extremely positive again, what do investors do? Why, they jump right back in there and create yet another mania. And Robert, I'm afraid to say that's simply a story of human nature.
Matt, you said the overconfidence effect is well recognized, and some of our viewers will probably be familiar with the famous Dunning-Kruger study. It's done by researchers at Cornell. And the name of their study tells you a lot of what you need to know. It was unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence lead to self-inflated assessments. And this study was done in an academic setting with non-financial topics, but it's all too easy to see how it can apply to the average investor. The only thing worse than making a bad decision is to make a bad decision and think it's good, as in unskilled and unaware of it.
Yeah, that's a particularly well-known cognitive bias study. The researchers published it in 1999, and since then we've just seen it inspire so many other studies on overconfidence in a host of areas.
Yeah, when I see a well-done study with an interesting outcome, I sometimes imagine, wow, I'd love to see this done as a longitudinal study with 10,000 people across 20 years. But it's just I can never find anybody with a spare couple of $1 million to finance the idea.
Well, research it is expensive. It's certainly not cheap. So yeah, I hear you. In socionomics, we really like to look at the data over the long term, and who knows, maybe someday we'll have someone with the budget to take a shot at that. But Robert, I did want to mention, we've talked about the overconfidence effect, and we've talked about it being more prevalent when social mood is positive. If we change gears and think about a cognitive bias that we should be more aware of when social mood turns negative, is there one that comes to mind for you?
Yeah. What comes to mind for me is confirmation bias, and that's for a couple of reasons. Self-inflicted wound is a fitting, if less fancy name for it. Cognitive bias is the tendency to filter information in a way that conforms to what you already believe. And it leads you to cling to what you believe despite clear contrary evidence, even as you find support or correlations in unrelated or even irrelevant data and events, right? And as negative mood increases, confirmation bias can also lead to what they call attitude polarization. And that's where, the same single piece of evidence will simply become the confirmation that drives people closer to their own opposing tribes and groups and parties. And that gets me to the deeper reason I think confirmation bias is a big danger when mood is negative. Namely, all the behaviors I just described are manifestations of magical thinking. And you and I both know Bob Prechter has written a lot about magical thinking in bear markets because it can lead to attacks on reason, can lead to collectivism. It can even lead to war, going to war. And so, yes, confirmation bias can feed fear, and the bad outcomes of that, they can range from war to an over-aversion to risk in the markets, in business, and beyond.
Well, yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, when you're talking about this tendency to polarize, when mood becomes negative, gosh, do we ever see that? And folks can form judgments about other groups, and then suddenly they use that filter to interpret everything they learn about that group as though it just reconfirms their pre-existing beliefs. So I think you're spot on about that tendency. I mean, the creation of echo chambers, that kind of thing, that can become particularly acute. The danger of that can be particularly acute when mood turns negative. But I wonder if we also see confirmation bias in positive mood periods. For example, if we think about the investing lens, in major bull markets, often we see people interpret basically any source of information, any piece of information, as though it supports a bullish case for the market. You see this in financial media all the time, where no matter what the news is, if the mood is bullish, they'll find a reason to make a bullish case using whatever evidence is available. So I wonder if maybe confirmation bias is something that can be prevalent both in positive and negative mood environments. It just takes a different shape based on the mood trend.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. And, in the same way that we sometimes have to remind ourselves that social mood itself is always a mix, you get extremes in positive and negative mood, but it's never absolute.
Well, we know there's always a mix, that's for sure. Now, we're talking about biases that might show up more often or might be better to be aware of in a negative mood environment. Another one that comes to mind for me is the opposite of overconfidence, and that is underconfidence. When we're underconfident, society sees the world so pessimistically that folks don't get out of bed and produce, so to speak. They take fewer risks in business. They undervalue the potential of their own abilities and their own contribution. And Psychology Today wrote an article in 2018 about underconfidence and had this great line. It said, "The cost of underconfidence is the opportunity cost of adventures not taken, the lights undiscovered, and the life unlived." So, gosh, Robert, with everything that we've discussed in mind, do you have any insights into how we can manage our cognitive biases? Of course, a simple awareness of them, hey, that's a good start, but what are your thoughts beyond that?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, and I'll say this emphatically. Please never be more attached to a story than you are to the facts that may contradict that story. This is not unlike meeting your hero, right? When you do meet your hero and that person falls short of what you expect, you're likely to be really disappointed. And you see where I'm going with this. Most of us know a story from history that inspires us, that we think is factually accurate. And yet, at a later point, it becomes really hard to learn about contrary facts, which may diminish the story and diminish the inspiration it provides to you. And trust me, this is advice I've given to myself because of my own experience. I absolutely love a good story. Part of my job is to tell stories, but I do that only after I take the time to gather and to check the facts of the story itself. And I do try to follow the lead of really good documentarians like Ken Burns. Recently, he did a series about Ernest Hemingway, one of my favorite writers and authors. And Ken Burns absolutely presented Hemingway's greatness as a writer. But he also pulled no punches about Hemingway's personal life, and a lot of that was not great at all. And it was disappointing, but Burns was telling the whole true story. And if the facts contradict the story in your head, please believe the facts and correct the way you see the story. That's what I say, Matt. What's your comment?
Well, that's fantastic, Robert. I haven't seen that Hemingway documentary, but now I'm intrigued. I'll have to check that out. We talked a little bit about echo chambers and how that can be a danger. I think this dovetails with what you just shared with us. Yeah, when mood turns negative, there's this tendency toward tribalism. There's this tendency to go us versus them. And it can become so valuable to, one, be aware of any echo chambers or information silos that you're in, and then to sample some information from the other side, because sometimes you'll see the same story, but it will be reported a different way, or there'll be a different spin on it. And it's not a case of, one interpretation is right and the other is wrong, but simply being aware that there are multiple interpretations of events, and there's more than one way to perceive them and understand their significance can help to broaden your own thinking and help you to think more independently, because you're not just beholden to the interpretations that you'll find in your own echo chamber.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just one other point is, particularly when we're talking about extremes and overconfidence or underconfidence, if you find not only yourself, but basically everyone you read in the newspaper or see on television just fully committed to one case, say in the markets, for example, that extremity of opinion is itself a contrary socionomic indicator. And when you start to recognize that, sometimes you can even see it in yourself. So if, say, you're a fairly risk-averse person, but maybe uh, around this time last year, you found yourself thinking, oh man, maybe I really should get into those cryptocurrencies. That in itself can be an indicator. And if you're self-aware enough to recognize that, then you can help to perhaps recognize an extreme in trend and dodge a risk that might be difficult to do otherwise. So these are some perspectives, some insights about cognitive biases. Hopefully, these will help you to think more clearly as we go through an important shift in the social mood trend. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have any feedback for us, please do feel free to get in touch. The email address is institute@socionomics.net. That's institute@socionomics.net. Robert, thank you so much for this conversation. Let's talk again soon.
Matt, happy holidays to you, and thanks to everyone who watches us, and here's to a better 2023.
Sounds good, Robert. Take care.